It's June 29th, 1980 in Newark, Delaware. 26-year-old Anne Manchester was inside her apartment at the Villa Belmont complex, studying for an important exam scheduled for the following morning. In just 3 days, she was set to receive her degree from the University of Delaware after years of working towards her MBA. At around 2 o'clock that afternoon, a friend spoke with Anne on the phone. Nothing seemed unusual. But sometime after that call, something happened inside apartment number 9. Anne's purse, wallet, keys, and car were all left behind. But Anne vanished. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Case Uncovered, where we uncover some of the most compelling and lesser-known true crime cases. I'm your host, Jen Rivera. Today's case takes us to Newark, Delaware, to an abduction and disappearance that, more than 4 decades later, still leaves behind far more questions than answers. Anne Manchester was intelligent, disciplined, and deeply focused on building her future. Friends and classmates described her as quiet but driven, someone who had spent years working toward her goals and was preparing to begin the next chapter of her life. But in the summer of 1980, Anne suddenly disappeared without explanation. And almost immediately, investigators began looking closely at a relationship in Anne's life that had recently taken a troubling turn. This is the abduction and disappearance of Anne Manchester. Before Anne Manchester became a missing persons case, she was a woman quietly building a future for herself. Anne Denise Victoria Manchester was born on June 10, 1954, in Wilmington, Delaware, to Andrew Hopping Manchester, who went by Jack, and Joyce Ann Cook Manchester. She was the couple's second child, born 4 years after her older brother David. For part of Anne's childhood, the family lived in Walnut Creek, California, after her father was transferred there through his work as an engineer with Hercules Powder Company. But by 1966, the family had returned to Delaware, where Anne would spend the rest of her life. From an early age, Anne appeared to be extremely driven academically. She attended Alexis I. DuPont High School and graduated in 1973. According to yearbook records, Anne was involved in several organizations during high school, including Future Teachers of America, the AFS Club, the Press Club, and Frosh and Soft Staff. In 1972, she also received honorable mention in Delaware's Betty Crocker Homemaker of Tomorrow competition. Those details may seem small, but they help paint a picture of who Anne was. She was involved, structured, goal-oriented, the kind of person who took pride in doing things well. After high school, Anne attended Allegheny College in Pennsylvania, where she majored in economics. During the 1974 to 1975 academic year, she studied abroad in France through the Institute of American Universities. At the time, studying abroad wasn't nearly as common or accessible as it is today, and that experience says a lot about Anne's independence and ambition. By 1976, she had earned her bachelor's degree in economics. After graduating, she returned to Delaware and began working as a secretary for Phoenix Steel Corporation in Claymont. But eventually, she made a decision that would completely reshape her future. She left her job and committed herself fully to graduate school. Anne enrolled in the MBA program at the University of Delaware and moved into her own apartment at the Villa Belmont complex on Welsh Tract Road in Newark. According to those who knew her, she took her education incredibly seriously. During one academic term, Anne carried 15 credits while the average student was taking 12. During the summer session before her disappearance, she was enrolled in 2 courses while most students only took 1. Her grades reflected that dedication. Out of 5 courses, Anne reportedly earned 4 A's and 1 B. She was described as quiet but focused, reserved but not antisocial, a woman who had direction in her life and knew exactly what she wanted her future to look like. And after years of sacrifice and hard work, Anne was only 3 days away from receiving her degree when she disappeared. That detail becomes incredibly important later in this case, because investigators had to determine whether Anne had left voluntarily. And when you look at who Anne was, nothing about her life suggests someone preparing to walk away from everything she had worked so hard to build. Sometime around early 1979, Anne became involved with a man named Bernard Francis Tanderick. And over time, that relationship would become one of the most troubling aspects of this entire case. Anne was in her mid-20s at the time. Bernard was 39 years old. But it wasn't just the age difference that concerned Anne's family once they learned about the relationship. Bernard was married. He and his wife Florence had married in 1962 and had 4 children together. By the late 1970s, however, the marriage appeared to be falling apart, and Bernard was reportedly living separately in a rented apartment in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. But still, he wasn't divorced. According to Anne's parents, they didn't even know about the relationship until January of 1980, meaning Anne had apparently kept it private for quite some time. And honestly, that detail speaks volumes. Because people often keep relationships secret when they already know the situation is complicated or potentially unhealthy. On paper, Bernard appeared successful and educated. He had attended Uniontown High School in Pennsylvania, later graduating from Penn State University in 1962, before eventually going on to work for Lucan Steel Company in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. But according to Anne's parents, by 1980, the relationship had already begun deteriorating. They later told investigators that Anne had attempted to distance herself from Bernard multiple times, but struggled because she felt sorry for him. And unfortunately, situations like this are not uncommon. Many women attempting to leave emotionally intense or controlling relationships try to do so gently. They try not to hurt the other person. They try to keep the peace. But sometimes the other person refuses to let go. And according to investigators, tensions between Anne and Bernard escalated dramatically just 11 days before Anne disappeared. On June 18, 1980, Bernard came to Anne's apartment wanting to talk. At some point, the two got into his vehicle and drove to a vacant area near Coatesville, Pennsylvania. While there, Bernard reportedly pointed out a lot where he claimed he planned to build a house for the two of them. But during that conversation, Anne told him she wanted to begin seeing other people. What happened next would later become one of the most chilling details in the entire investigation. According to Anne herself, Bernard grabbed her by the throat and then told her, "If I can't have you, no one else will." Anne later shared details of the incident with at least 2 people, including her friend Tim Lander and a neighbor named Frank Kreutzer. According to those who knew her, Anne was deeply uncomfortable after the incident. She reportedly dreaded seeing Bernard again. That word comes up repeatedly in this case. Dreaded. Not nervous, not hesitant. Dreaded. And despite what had happened, Anne was apparently still expected to meet with Bernard again on June 29th, the same day she disappeared. According to her neighbor Frank, Anne had specifically stated she would only speak with Bernard either outside in the parking lot or on the balcony, not inside the apartment. That detail is important because it suggests Anne was trying to create distance and maintain some level of safety after what had happened 11 days earlier. But unfortunately, sometimes people underestimate how dangerous a situation has truly become. On the evening of June 28, 1980, Anne went to a party in Philadelphia with her friend Tim. Tim was 26 years old and worked for Girard Bank in Philadelphia. According to reports, he and Anne were friends and had spent time together socially before. The two attended the party together and stayed late into the night, or rather, early into the morning. By the time they left Philadelphia and drove back to Newark, it was around 4 o'clock in the morning on June 29th. They arrived back at Anne's apartment at the Villa Belmont complex around 4:30 a.m. At some point after returning to the apartment, Anne made Tim pancakes. The two spent the morning together before he eventually left around 12:30 that afternoon and returned to Pennsylvania. According to Tim, Anne was aware that Bernard was expected to come by later that day. More importantly, she wasn't looking forward to it. Again, multiple people later described Anne as dreading the planned meeting. And honestly, when you look at the timeline of this case, that detail becomes impossible to ignore. Despite the incident that took place 11 days earlier when Bernard threatened Anne, there still appeared to be unfinished business between them. Whether that involved returning belongings, ending the relationship formally, or simply attempting one final conversation, we don't know. But what we do know is this: June 29th would be the last known day Anne was ever seen. After Tim left Anne's apartment around 12:30 that afternoon, Anne was alone. At around 2 o'clock, a friend spoke with Anne on the phone. According to reports, nothing about the conversation appeared unusual. They discussed school-related matters, and Anne gave no indication that anything was wrong. At the time, Anne was preparing for an important exam scheduled for the following morning, and in just 3 days, she was supposed to graduate. Everything in Anne's life seemed to indicate she was focused on the future. But sometime after that phone call, something happened inside apartment number 9. When investigators and Anne's family later entered the apartment, several details immediately stood out. Anne's purse had been left behind. So had her wallet, her money, her identification, her checkbooks, both sets of her keys, and her vehicle remained parked outside the apartment complex. Inside the apartment, Anne's textbooks were still sitting on the dining room table beside a glass of diet soda and a pack of cigarettes. Her sandals rested right underneath the table. And according to those who knew Anne, she was not the type of person to simply leave without telling someone. She also wasn't someone who walked places casually. Her father later described her as a car person, meaning if she planned on going somewhere, she would drive. The idea that Anne voluntarily left the apartment without her car, purse, keys, or shoes made absolutely no sense to the people who knew her best. Even more unsettling, there were no obvious signs of a struggle inside the apartment. Everything appeared neat and orderly. But one detail deeply disturbed Anne's parents. The door was unlocked. According to her family, Anne was known for being cautious and consistently keeping her apartment locked. That wasn't normal for her. And adding another eerie layer to the timeline, a severe thunderstorm reportedly moved through the Newark area later that evening. The kind of storm that keeps people indoors. The kind of storm that masks sound. And somewhere between that final phone call around 2 o'clock and the storm that rolled through later that night, Anne disappeared. Anne wasn't officially reported missing until July 9th, 1980, 10 days after she vanished. The reason for that delay was because her parents had been away on vacation. When Jack and Joyce Manchester returned home on July 8th, they attempted to contact Anne, but they weren't able to reach her. At first, they may not have immediately panicked. Anne was an adult living independently and focused heavily on school. But as more time passed without hearing from her, concern quickly began to grow. The following morning, July 9th, they tried calling again. Still no answer. At the same time, Tim Lander had reportedly also been trying to contact Anne in the days following the party, but had been unable to reach her. Eventually, Jack and Joyce drove to Anne's apartment. When they arrived, Anne's blue Honda was still parked outside. That immediately alarmed them. They went upstairs to apartment number 9 and tried the door. Unlocked. Inside the apartment appeared almost frozen in time. Anne's belongings were still there, but Anne was nowhere to be found. And according to her father, he believed one person was responsible: Bernard. Jack reportedly contacted Bernard directly and demanded to know what he had done with his daughter. Bernard denied knowing anything about Anne's disappearance and claimed he had not seen her in approximately 10 days. After that conversation, Jack contacted police. And just like that, what should have been one of the most exciting weeks of Anne's life instead became the beginning of a missing persons investigation. The initial investigation into Anne's disappearance began on July 9th, 1980. Sergeant Calvin Kramis Jr. responded and took the missing persons report before investigators quickly began interviewing people close to Anne, including Bernard. Police located Bernard at his workplace, Luke and Steel Company, in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, later that same day. During questioning, he admitted he had been involved with Anne for approximately a year and a half. He also admitted to investigators that he had a key to her apartment. And according to reports, Bernard acknowledged making the statement, "If I can't have you, no one else will." However, he attempted to downplay the comment, claiming he meant no harm and was simply jealous of anyone else Anne might have been seeing. Bernard also confirmed he had been expected to meet with Anne on June 29th. But his timeline raised questions. According to Bernard, he spent part of the afternoon of June 29th visiting his estranged wife and children before eventually returning to his apartment in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, where he claimed he waited for Anne to contact him. But investigators noted inconsistencies, because according to multiple people close to Anne, the meeting with Bernard had already been planned. So why would she need to call him? And why did Bernard's timeline place him arriving late for a meeting that was supposedly already scheduled? Those questions would continue to linger over the case for years, especially because investigators now knew something else incredibly important. Bernard had access to Anne's apartment. He didn't need Anne to open the door for him. And that detail changes the way investigators had to look at what may have happened inside apartment number 9. One of the most unsettling details in Anne Manchester's case is how little evidence was left behind. No sign of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no indication of a violent struggle inside the apartment. And in some ways, that almost makes the case more disturbing, because investigators had to consider the possibility that Anne may have willingly opened the door for someone she knew, or that the person who entered didn't need her to open the door at all. Bernard also claimed he had previously kept personal belongings in Anne's apartment, though he stated he had already retrieved them. But that raises another important question. If Bernard had already collected his belongings, what exactly was the purpose of the planned meeting on June 29th? Because according to Anne's neighbor, Frank, Anne had specifically stated she would only speak with Bernard either outside in the parking lot or on the balcony after the choking incident on June 18th, not inside the apartment. That detail strongly suggests Anne was trying to create boundaries and avoid being alone with him in an enclosed space. And honestly, when you step back and look at the scene investigators found inside the apartment, the timeline becomes incredibly unsettling. It appeared as though whatever happened quickly, possibly quickly enough that Anne never had time to gather anything. Now, cases like this are a reminder that danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from people we know, people we trust, people who already have access to our lives. And unfortunately, situations can escalate incredibly fast. That's one of the reasons I partner with Safely. The Safely Sidekick is an all-in-one personal safety device that includes a personal alarm, pepper spray, a flashlight, and a glass breaker, all compact enough to carry on your keychain or in your bag every day. It's designed to help people feel a little more prepared and a little more protected in situations where instincts tell you something may not be right. To get your own personal safety products, you can head to livesafely.co and use code JEN for 10% off your order. Thank you to Safely for sponsoring today's episode. Now, let's get back to the case. As investigators continued interviewing people close to Anne, a clearer picture of her life in the days leading up to her disappearance began to emerge. And nearly every person investigators spoke with described Anne the same way. Focused, responsible, goal-oriented. There were no indications she intended to disappear voluntarily. No packed bags, no withdrawn money, no evidence she had plans to leave Newark. In fact, Anne appeared deeply committed to her future, as we know. She was preparing for her exams, preparing to graduate. And according to university staff and classmates, she had been taking on an especially demanding academic workload leading up to the summer of 1980. Investigators also learned more about the June 18th incident involving Bernard. And honestly, viewed through a modern lens, that incident becomes incredibly significant. Today, experts in domestic violence and relationship violence often point to strangulation or choking as one of the strongest indicators that abuse may escalate to homicide. And according to Anne, Bernard had already placed his hands around her throat while threatening that if he couldn't have her, no one else would. That was less than 2 weeks before she disappeared. At some point during the investigation, authorities also searched a steel vat at the Lucan steel plant where Bernard worked. Just hearing that detail is chilling. The temperatures inside industrial steel vats can reach thousands of degrees. And while investigators ultimately found no evidence connected to Anne during that search, the fact that authorities considered the possibility at all says a lot about where suspicion in this case appeared to be centered. Police also explored other leads over the years. At one point, a psychic claimed Anne had been killed and buried in a wooded area nearby, although those claims led nowhere. Search efforts continued, but as weeks turned into months and months turned into years, the case slowly began to grow cold. Anne's family became desperate for answers. They offered a $1,000 reward for information connected to her disappearance. Less than a week later, that reward was increased to $5,000. But despite media coverage and ongoing investigative efforts, no major breakthroughs came. No confirmed sightings, no physical evidence publicly tying anyone to Anne's disappearance, and no body. And over time, the silence surrounding the case only became more haunting. Because from the outside looking in, there appeared to be one central figure investigators repeatedly circled back to. The man who had threatened Anne, the man who reportedly frightened her, the man who was expected to meet her on the very day she vanished, and who had a key to her apartment. And yet, no charges were ever filed. No arrest was ever made. Over the years, Bernard Tanderick continued living his life. He eventually divorced Florence and later remarried. And according to more recent research into the case, as of 2025, Bernard was still very much alive and living in Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, Anne's family has spent decade after decade living with unanswered questions. Questions that only became heavier with time. Because every birthday, every holiday, every graduation season would have been another painful reminder of the life Anne never got to finish living. When you really step back and examine this case as a whole, several details become incredibly difficult to ignore. First, there's the issue of timing. Anne disappeared at a moment when her life appeared to be moving forward in meaningful ways. She was succeeding academically. She was days away from graduation. And according to the people closest to her, she had plans for the future. There's simply no evidence suggesting she intended to abandon her life voluntarily. Then there's the apartment itself. The scene investigators found on July 9th did not resemble someone preparing to leave permanently. Her money remained behind, her identification, her purse, her car, her keys, and perhaps most hauntingly, her sandals remained underneath the dining room table. That detail may seem minor, but psychologically it says a lot. It suggests interruption, a moment that was never supposed to become permanent. And then there's the issue of access. Whoever Anne encountered that day either gained entry without forcing their way inside, was willingly let in by Anne, or already had the means to enter. Investigators knew Bernard had a key. They also knew Anne had recently become fearful enough of him that she reportedly no longer wanted to meet with him privately inside her apartment. And yet somehow, after that final phone call around 2 o'clock, she vanished without a trace. No witnesses publicly reported hearing a disturbance. No one reported screams. No one reported seeing Anne leave. And because a severe thunderstorm moved through the area later that evening, investigators had to consider the possibility that weather conditions may have masked sounds or activity that otherwise might have drawn attention. When you line up all of those details together, the picture becomes incredibly unsettling. As the years passed, Anne Manchester's disappearance slowly became one of Delaware's oldest unsolved missing persons cases. But for Anne's family, time never brought closure. It only brought more unanswered questions. Her parents spent decades searching for answers about what happened to their daughter. They continued speaking with investigators, continued hoping for movement in the case, and continued living with the reality that Anne had seemingly vanished without explanation. And honestly, one of the most heartbreaking aspects of cases like this is how life continues moving forward around the absence. Friends get older, families change, people pass away, but the missing person remains frozen in time. Anne was 26 years old when she disappeared. Forever 26. Meanwhile, the people who loved her were forced to continue living year after year without knowing what happened on the afternoon of June 29, 1980. Anne's mother eventually passed away in June of 2023, at the age of 93. She died without answers, without knowing where her daughter was, without knowing who was responsible. And sadly, that's a reality far too many families of the missing are forced to face. The decades also changed the way investigators and the public began viewing Anne's case. Because while relationship violence was certainly understood in 1980, conversations surrounding coercive control, stalking behaviors, strangulation threats, and intimate partner violence were nowhere near as developed as they are today. Now looking back, many of the warning signs in Anne's case stand out immediately. The escalating tension in the relationship, the inability to accept the relationship ending, the possessive language, the choking incident, the threat, and Anne's own fear leading up to the planned meeting. Today, investigators and experts often recognize those patterns for exactly what they are: serious danger indicators. And that reality makes Anne's disappearance even more difficult to sit with all these years later, because there are moments in this case where it feels like Anne herself understood something wasn't right. She no longer wanted to meet with Bernard privately. She told people she dreaded seeing him, and yet despite those instincts, whatever happened that afternoon still happened. More than 40 years later, there are still no definitive answers in Anne Manchester's case. No arrests, no known physical evidence publicly tying anyone to her disappearance. No confirmed sightings after June 29, 1980. But when you look at the totality of the circumstances, investigators have long focused on one central question. Did Anne's disappearance stem from the relationship she was trying to leave behind? Because there are simply too many details surrounding that relationship that are difficult to overlook. At the same time, it's important to remember something else. Investigators have never publicly announced enough evidence to charge anyone in Anne's disappearance. And that distinction matters. Because while public suspicion may exist, law enforcement still has to meet a legal threshold before bringing charges in a case like this. Still, the unanswered questions remain. What happened inside apartment number 9? Did Anne willingly step outside to speak with someone? Was she taken somewhere else? Did neighbors unknowingly miss something because of the storm later that evening? And perhaps most hauntingly, how did the person responsible for Anne's disappearance manage to leave behind virtually no trace? Because after all these years, Anne's case still feels suspended in time. The textbooks left out for studying, the untouched apartment, the belongings left behind, the sandals underneath the dining room table. All of it creates the feeling of a life interrupted in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Today, Anne Denise Victoria Manchester remains listed as a missing person through multiple databases, including NamUs and the Doe Network. At the time of her disappearance, Anne was approximately 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed around 115 pounds. She had brown hair, brown eyes, and was believed to possibly be wearing blue denim cutoff shorts with a small heart on the rear pocket. She also reportedly wore a silver wedding band despite not being married, along with a gold Timex watch. Anne's case remains open with the Newark Police Department, and despite the decades that have passed, investigators still encourage anyone with information to come forward, because someone out there knows something. Maybe it's a detail that once seemed insignificant. Maybe it's a memory someone never connected to the case. Or maybe it's information someone has been afraid to share for years. But cases like this are never truly closed while answers are still missing, and Anne Manchester's family deserves answers. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Anne Manchester, please contact the Newark Police Department at 302-366-7111. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Case Uncovered and for listening to Anne's story. Make sure you're following the podcast wherever you're listening so you don't miss when new episodes post every Tuesday and Thursday. I do also occasionally drop bonus episodes as well, so you don't want to miss those. If you've been a listener for a while, thank you so much for your support. And if you're new here, welcome. If you'd like to keep hearing cases like Anne's every week, the best way to support the show is by leaving a 5-star rating and review. It really helps more people find the podcast and listen to these stories. And you never know, it could lead to someone who knows something about the case. If you'd like to follow along with my advocacy work through my nonprofit, you can visit thereignitedproject.com. The Reignited Project is my 501c3 nonprofit organization where we are boots on the ground and helping families like Anne's every single day. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe out there.